What's good, YouTube? Today we're actually going to revisit the original fun tier list I did for all the DPS specs going into Dragonflight. There's obviously been some massive changes as we've gone through the beta cycles, so some of these classes have definitely suffered from that and some of them have obviously gained as well. First, if you're enjoying the content and want a free way to support your boy, then drop a sub to me down below. We also have a Dragonflight Heroic Edition giveaway that is currently running, but I am actually drawing the winner tonight on stream after this video is uploaded on Sunday the 27th of November, one day before Dragonflight. So if you've entered that giveaway, make sure to jump in the stream and we'll be drawing the winner live over at my Twitch. And lastly, I actually got accepted for the Twitch drops, so come join me over at my Twitch for the launch of Dragonflight. And if you spend 4 hours in the stream, you'll be getting yourself a Feldrake. And then also I was one of the few that got accepted for the Ichabod pet. So if you gift me 2 subs after the launch of Dragonflight, you'll get yourself the little PogChamp Ichabod Harvest Golem pet. So I'll be seeing you over at my Twitch for the launch. So let's crack back on with the tier list then. Obviously, I just want to preface that this tier list was purely based on a fun perspective. Obviously, that's very subjective to me, but I feel like I've got a good grasp on most of the specs. So I think they were fairly placed at the time. However, there's definitely some adjustments to be made now. We'll start with the S tier specs then. I'm pretty happy with where these 3 are placed for now. Enhancement obviously got the nerfs, but I'm not going to be basing this tier list off of any numbers to an extent because obviously it's no fun being below the tank on damage. These 3 specs at the top are all pretty much consistently global locked, which in my opinion is very fun. I like a higher APM playstyle. They all have great self-sustain as well, which I find very fun because you don't have to rely as much on your healer. And they all now have some nice depth to the classes as well, even the Havoc Demon Hunter, so you won't be getting bored of these specs anytime soon. Enhancement is obviously at the top just due to having the best audio and visual feedback in the game by an absolute landslide. Those big crash lightnings coming down, those Ascendance procs where you just shock everything in sight for massive AoE damage, and those big Storm Strike resets just make this spec the most fun in the game for me, and it definitely still deserves its top spot in the S tier. Havoc, again, a very flashy playstyle, jumping in and out of Metamorphosis every 2 seconds, and dashing about the place with the momentum style gameplay. I hated this playstyle at first, but it's really grown on me, and once you get used to it, it is definitely a blast to play. Fury, like I mentioned in the last video, it just has unlimited offensive cooldowns, and they're up for every single pack in Mythic Plus. So at the start of every pack, you just run in and do insane amounts of burst. Just be careful with your aggro. Outlaw is a spec that's very close to S tier for me, and I'm still debating putting it in S tier now. For now, I am going to keep it in the top of A tier though. Unfortunately, what holds it back for me is the gameplay doesn't really change based on whether it's single target or AoE. Obviously, you funnel all your damage into single target regardless of the scenario. So in Mythic Plus, for example, on an AoE pack, the only difference really that you're going to be making is pressing Blade Flurry and hitting 8 targets around you. However, this is very fluid and still very fun. It just unfortunately does hold it back from being that S tier spec for me. Arms is probably the first spec that I'm actually going to consider moving. I think I got a bit overhyped when I first placed it at the top of A. I had just come off the back of absolutely blasting in one of the Mythic Plus keys that I did, so I was definitely very hyped about the spec. I still think I'm going to keep it in A, but I'm just going to bring it a lot further down, probably to the bottom of the A tier for now. It still is very fun, don't get me wrong. You have incredible amounts of burst on very short cooldowns through talents like Anger Management, and obviously on single target bosses, for example, you have those insane execute windows where you will just see your DPS skyrocket, and if the fight goes on long enough, you will be at the top of the meters. Damage doesn't matter, by the way. Just for me, it does feel like it's missing something. Obviously, you've got the new sort of AoE rotation where you're cycling the Whirlwinds, the Thunderclaps, and the Cleaves, but all of these having their own mini cooldowns, sometimes there is a bit of downtime in AoE where you have to spend it on a single target ability, and in my opinion that doesn't feel too great. Next we go on to Beast Mastery Hunter. I'm still going to keep this up here. It's looking like it's going to be my main for Dragonflight. I feel like they've fleshed out this class a lot going into this expansion, even just through one talent in Kill Cleave. Just now being able to press Kill Command in AoE scenarios and it has an AoE impact is massive for this class, and that coupled with spawning lots of dire beasts through the different talents and having that army of pets just attacking your targets really fleshes out the class fantasy for me, and I am having a blast playing it so far. Feral is another class that I'm actually going to move. I think I'm going to put Feral in the S tier for fun. I pretty much instantly regretted not putting Feral in S tier after I made that last video. This spec feels so complete coming into Dragonflight, and I can look past being stuck in cat form for the whole expansion. Whether it's single target or AoE, this class really has an answer for everything. It's got huge AoE potential potential through your double clawed rake, which is a huge gain for the spec. But even more so, you obviously have tear open wounds, which is going to deal a portion of your AoE rip damage up front for some big AoE burst that the feral druid needed. And then other talents like rampant ferocity that is also going to make your ferocious bite cleave now. This spec obviously has a lot of depth to it. It's always been one of the hardest classes to play in the game, but I feel like it's not that overwhelming anymore. There's builds you can play where you're literally just swipe and primal wrath spamming, or there's builds you can play where you literally have like 5 or 6 dots, I think it is, which is insane, but very fun nonetheless. So feral has actually earned itself a spot in the S tier for me now, and if you were ever contemplating playing a feral druid, now is the time. I really couldn't recommend this spec enough. Next we have the Unholy DK, which I think, in all fairness, although BM's going to be probably my main for Dragonflight, I think I'm going to have to drag the Unholy DK just above it. You have so many different offensive cooldowns for this, which although can feel clunky with the amount of GCDs you have to spend, once you get rolling, this spec is a monster. You're summoning ghouls, popping your diseases everywhere, and just blowing everything up in an AoE scenario, and you'll be pretty much untouched on the DPS meter. You now have access to 2 death grips. You've got Abomination's Limb as well that's going to pull a mob in every 1 second as well. You just have stupid amounts of displacement, as any DK spec for that matter, but this just bumps up the Unholy even more. And I think Unholy DK mains in general are going to be very happy going into this expansion. Demonology Warlock is going to stay solidly in the A tier for me. I've always loved this spec. I am a bit of a sucker for the pet specs. Just summoning those armies of whether it's the wildlife for beast mastery, or obviously you've got all the demons coming out for demonology. I just think is such a fun and unique playstyle. And then obviously buffing them up with your Tyrant, making Tyrant feel like an impactful cooldown. However, I will say, I think Blizzard needs to make Tyrant do some considerable more damage. The keys that I've been running on this spec, Tyrant's literally been doing like 2% of my overall damage, which although obviously it buffs my other pets, it would be nice to have some of that turret damage from the Tyrant that we've been used to in previous expansions. For me, Demonology could easily be an S tier spec. I think they just need to rejumble some of the numbers around. A lot of your damage is coming from your cool Dreadstalker's ability, and I think this damage should be redistributed into abilities like the new Guillotine ability from your Felguard, just so you're not having one spell pretty much do all your damage regardless of the scenario. They obviously have insane talent builds like summoning the Pit Lord, which is just stupidly fun, and I hope that becomes meta for some fights. I think Assassination, unfortunately, is another spec that I sort of overestimated. I'm not going to move it too much, but I am going to drag it down into the B tier, just behind Shadow Priest. Like I've said before, Assassination is definitely a lot more fun. I couldn't stand this spec before and Feral Druid, just because you used to have to wait for your energy to come back to actually press your buttons, which on a long enough fight is definitely still the case in a single target scenario. But with abilities like Thistletea, if you talent into that, your energy regen is not as much of a problem as it was before. They have improved leaps and bounds in AoE too, through abilities like Indiscriminate Carnage. Every minute being able to apply Rupture and Garrote to 8 mobs really helps out what they were lacking before with their AoE sort of burst, but it does help them ramp up that much quicker. I think their rework to Vendetta through Deathmark is a sick and unique remodel of the ability. Just applying that extra application of your poisons, your Ruptures and Garrotes works very nicely for the spec and the whole fantasy of it. Unfortunately, Assassination has just never really grabbed me, especially compared to the other rogue specs like the Outlaw Rogue, so I am just going to bring it down into the B tier for now. Windwalker, I'm going to keep in the A tier. Similar to other classes in this tier, you have a stupid amount of offensive cooldowns through Zwen, you got Bone Dust Brew, and obviously your 2 charges of Storm, Earth and Fire, meaning you have an offensive ability for pretty much any scenario you find yourself in. I've always loved the weaving of the spells with the Windwalker Monk. Pressing an ability you haven't previously pressed always keeps you on your toes and remembering the last ability you actually pressed, so that definitely just adds a baseline amount of depth to the class that you don't really find in many other classes. You also have unlimited defensive cooldowns as a Windwalker Monk, and throwing around those kicks and punches and summoning your big Zwen boy makes this spec a blast to play. I think just speaking about it now, I've actually convinced myself to drag it up a little bit in the A tier. I think I'm going to whack it just behind Unholy but above BM. That was a bit spontaneous of me, I know, but I do think this spec deserves it. So next we're on to the B tier. Elemental's definitely come a long way on the beta. For me, it still does feel a little bit clunky, especially in AoE situations. It feels like you have so many buttons to press, but for some people, that might be for them. Personally, I don't like having to weave your lava bursts. You now use Ice Fury on AoE situations as well, because your Frost Shock is now cleaving if you talent into it. Then somehow you have to find space to weave in Chain Lightnings, your Earthquakes, your Earth Shocks, or elemental blasts, and keep flame shocks up on some of those targets at the same time. It just feels like you have so many buttons with not enough time to press them all. But obviously, being a shaman spec, whoever does the art and audio for this class needs a pay rise at Blizzard, because these classes can literally do no damage and you will still have all the fun in the world playing them, purely because of that reason. I am going to keep elemental at the top of the B tier. Saying all this though, I am going to keep elemental at the top of the B tier. I think specifically in a single target scenario, it could be very fun, and maybe once I get a bit more used to the AoE clunkiness, if you can call it that, then I'll have a better time on this spec. Same with the Shadow Priest, I'm going to keep it exactly where it is. Shadow Priest is actually probably one of my favorite dot specs in the game, barring Feral Druid probably. The class fantasy is unreal for this class. I think it's definitely up there with one of the top class fantasies in the game. And from what I've seen and heard, it has a very complex rotation as well, which is always going to keep you on your toes, and you're never going to get bored of this spec. You now obviously have ways to keep up in AoE scenarios as well. Through Shadow Crash applying your dots now, if talented into it, you can ramp up that much quicker, which this spec definitely suffered from in the previous expansions. So solid B tier for me for the Shadow Priest, and it's going to stay where it is. Now we'll go on to the Arcane Mage. Again, I'm going to keep Arcane where it is. With the rework to the Arcane Power ability into Arcane Surge, it's brought some new life to the spec, obviously bringing your mana management into it that much more. It's still going to be the king of close, it's still going to be the close quarter king of cleave, and obviously almost being a melee hybrid, having to be in those close quarters to use your arcane explosions definitely brings a unique feel to the mage class when you're playing this spec. Next, we're going to move on to Fire Mage, which I'm actually going to drag down the B tier. When making my previous tier list video, I hadn't seen that much Fire Mage gameplay on the beta, so I didn't realize that they were back to the old BFA playstyle where regardless of the situation, they're always going to be using their single target combust rotation, which I think makes this spec lack variance. Obviously, the combust window is very fun in itself. However, I'm not a fan of playing my spec for 10 seconds every 2 minutes, unless obviously talented into the kindling talent. And on top of that, having no difference between your single target and AoE rotation, similar to the Outlaw Rogue, doesn't gel with me. And so for now, I'm going to put this at the bottom of B tier. Obviously, it's just had the nerfs to its ignite damage as well, so that has definitely impacted the spec massively. From a performance perspective and an enjoyment perspective, this spec is now probably one of my least favorite in the game, but that sweet combust window is just propping it up to the B tier. Next, we're back to Sub Rogue. Again, not much has changed for the Sub Rogue going from Shadowlands to Dragonflight. I do enjoy the spec, especially in a single target scenario. It has insane amounts of burst and actually some pretty decent mass AoE numbers as well. The Shadow Dance burst windows are definitely a blast to play with, and because of this, it has some nice depth to the class, that's for sure. But unfortunately, from a fun perspective, I think it does just lose out to the other two Rogue specs. Although previous to Dragonflight, I would have definitely rated Sub Rogue above the Assassination Rogue. But due to the changes we've had to Assassination specifically, I believe from a fun perspective, Sub now loses out to Assassination 2. Next on to Frost DK, which I'm actually going to bash down a few levels in the B tier as well. I'm going to drag this one just behind Survival Hunter. I think I slightly overrated the Frost DK in my last tier list video. It's still a very bursty spec, but obviously still relies around that Breath of Sindragosa window, which I know for a fact a lot of people do not enjoy. It has some nice procs, and like I said before, big shiny buttons equals big dopamine, but this spec is relatively simple, and due to most of your damage coming from that Breath of Sindragosa window again, I just have to knock it down a few levels from where it was at before. Saying that though, because of the Frostworm's Fury, it's definitely keeping its spot in the B tier, and through the class talent trees, you get abilities like Abomination's Limb, and obviously the extra charge on Death Grip, which definitely brings a lot more flavor to the spec. Back to Hunter then, which I'm actually going to drag up a few levels in the B tier. I really didn't enjoy the spec the first couple of times I played it, but it's now definitely grown on me. Obviously, it hasn't been performing the best, and even with the 10% buffs recently, it's still not quite there. However, from a gameplay perspective, with your true shot windows being able to talent into one massive true shot or reduce cooldown on your true shot, which affects your gameplay massively, and then also talents like Wailing Arrow, resetting the cooldown of Rapid Fire and both charges of Aim Shot, this spec has become a lot more fluid, and it is incredibly bursty, especially with a new talent like Salvo, tying 2 explosive shots to your rapid fires or multi-shots every 45 seconds. It also has a buff to its sustained damage through talents like Bullet Storm, which was definitely missing from the spec before. You don't want to do all your damage in one burst window and then not do any damage until your next true shot window. So talents like Bullet Storm are definitely appreciated. Next we go on to Balance Druid, which is probably one of the 2 specs in this list that I was massively wrong about. Although we obviously had the massive changes to Starfall, being able to stack that now, I wasn't really vibing with this spec at first. However, playing it more recently, I've had an incredible time on this spec with abilities like Orbital Strike and interactions with Waning Moonlight, where you have to keep up 3 dots on your target for it to take increased damage. It adds a lot of depth to the spec, which it was definitely lacking before, and it feels like every 3 seconds now you have a full moon falling from the sky and just crushing enemies in that affected area. This spec never runs out of its resources, being astral power, so you're always constantly able to dump AP into Starfalls or Star Surges depending on the type of fight you're in. So for this spec, I'm dragging this up straight to the top of A tier. It's looking like a great expansion for the Druid class. Obviously, Balance could use some performance buffs, but that is not what this tier list is about. So top of A tier we go for the Boomkins. Survival Hunter, after playing it for a while, I've actually thoroughly enjoyed, and tied to the class that I'm going to probably be mainly in Dragonflight, I am going to drag it up a little bit. This spec has had a lot of changes going into Dragonflight. It no longer seems to be just bomb spam and bomb damage. You're taking talents like Butchery, which is basically just 3 charges of your carve. There's many different talents to reduce the cooldown on your different abilities, like Wildfire Bombs, for example. You obviously have Fury of the Eagle coming back from Legion, which is a very nice ability. And going further into the Legion playstyle, it seems, and fingers crossed it stays this way, that we're going with the Mongoose Bite playstyle. Just feeding those Mongoose Bites into huge bursty damage windows, just further buffing up that Mongoose Bite damage, really gives this spec a nice gameplay loop, especially in a single target situation. So I'm going to drag this spec up just behind Shadow Priest, but above Hunter. I am loving all of the Hunter specs. B tier is by no means a bad placement in this tier list. All of the specs in this tier I do still thoroughly enjoy. So going on to our last B tier spec from the previous tier list is the Affliction Warlock. They've made some nice changes to this spec going into Dragonflight 2, with Dark Glare actually now being an impactful ability, doing some big damage with Grim Reach, and actually feels like it's worth pressing now. It has some nice interactions with 3 Malefic Raptures, and you're pretty much as tanky as a protection warrior, so I'm going to drag this one up just in front of the Assassination Rogue and have that further up in the B tier. I think I was a bit harsh on this spec before, and I definitely need to correct that, so that is why I've bumped it up a few levels. Finally, we're going on to the C tier. All these specs I think I was pretty much right about, except one massive mistake I made, but that kind of changed with the fixes that Blizzard made to this spec, obviously being the newest in the game. I really didn't like this spec before, and like I said in the last video, I'm really not one of those people that doesn't like anything new. I'll always give something a go, but I had to give it an honest opinion last time, and I really did not enjoy it. Spamming Disintegrate in AoE situations was not fun at all, and they have definitely improved this spec a lot, but that was expected. So for this spec, I'm actually going to drag it to the top of B tier, I think. The Devastation Evoker has so much upfront burst. It really is a blast to play, especially in lower keys when everything just dies to your insane burst. You obviously have amazing visuals from the Evoker through abilities like Deep Breath, where you just fly over the battlefield and deal huge AoE damage to anything in its path. You have abilities like Hover, allowing you to cast on the move, which is definitely handy and brings you some flexibility with the spec. The massive downside to me for this spec, personally, is that you can't see your transmog most of the time. Again, with like the Druid forms, obviously you can see the shoulders and tabard and belt, I think, but for me that's just not enough. I need to see everything. Otherwise, this maybe could have placed itself in the A tier maybe. It doesn't have the most depth, unfortunately, either. It seems to be a pretty simple rotation once you get it down, but at the start of any pack you're going to be global locked, going from Fire Breaths to Eternity Surges, spamming Pyre and using your Deep Breath whenever it's off cooldown. So this spec definitely doesn't deserve to be in the bottom of C, and I think I almost put it in D tier last time. It's definitely improved drastically and now slots itself nicely at the top of the B tier. Like I just said though, the specs that are in C tier currently are pretty much going to stay there. For this tier, I'm going to say it's kind of a free-for-all, like they're not really in any specific order. If anything, I would probably drag Frostmage to the top of C tier. They're all pretty bland. I'm pretty sure Ret Paladins aren't happy with the design of their spec going into Dragonflight. Destro Lock seems to be the same old Rain of Fire spam it Dragonflight, it does get more fun personally in a single target scenario, lashing out those huge chaos bolts, but unfortunately just the AoE interactions for me don't really cut it. So these 3 specs are going to stay in the C tier. Frost Mage 2 hasn't really changed much. It seems to be the Frozen Orb spam Blizzard sort of playstyle, and in between spam your Ice Lances and Flurries. On single target though, it does have a fluid rotation, which is why it's probably at the top of the C tier for me. But yeah, this is my final fun tier list as we go into Dragonflight. I got a lot of comments on my last video saying that I must be a melee main, which is simply not the case. Like I said, I'm probably going Hunter for Dragonflight, and in previous expansions I've always played Boomy or Mage. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what type of playstyle you prefer, Dragonflight seems to cater towards melee specs a lot more, and that is the reasoning for why these specs are flooding the top of the tiers. We still do obviously have the Boomy up there with the Beast Mastery Hunter and the Demonology Warlock, which I've always kind of found the most fun range DPS anyway. Well, maybe not Beast Mastery in previous expansions, but you get my drift. We have a large amount obviously in the B tier. These are specs that could use some love, but overall you will have a great time playing them. So don't let it put you off their 2 tiers down from the top. Regardless of what you play in Dragonflight, it's looking like an amazing expansion coming up, and we're only 1 day out. So if you would make any changes to this tier list, please let me know down in the comments below. Maybe you're a Ret Pala diehard and you think it should be the top of S tier, or maybe you hate being stuck in cat form so much that you would rate Feral Druid at the bottom of D tier. Let me know any changes you'd make, or what you thought I got wrong or what I got right. I know it's hard to be positive down there, but if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to drop a like, drop a sub to your boy. Like I said, we're going to do a massive stream for the Dragonflight launch tomorrow night on the 28th. And until then, I'll catch you later.